My name is Staff Sergeant Erica Ward. At 32 years old, I'm in Kandahar, Afghanistan, where the 120-degree heat can kill you as fast as a bullet. Here, I am a leader, a respected soldier. But to my family back in Tennessee, I am nothing. In the middle of a patrol rotation, I received an email from my father. No pleasantries, no greeting. Just a cold, hard ultimatum. This little game of playing soldier is over. You will either come home immediately to take care of your brother like a woman should, or you will never see a single cent of this family's inheritance. I looked at my soldiers, men who would die for me, and then back at those words. My choice took less than a second. They thought writing me out of the will was the end. They had no idea it was the opening shot of a war they could never win. If you've ever been forced by your own family to choose between your dignity and their approval, let me know where you're listening from. Hit like and subscribe, because this is the story of how a discarded daughter came home to take it all back. The silence in this part of Kandahar province is a living thing. It's not empty, it's full of menace. It presses in on you, fills your ears until the rhythmic crunch of your own boots on the gravel sounds like a betrayal. Every rock looks like a pressure plate. Every shadow stretching from a mud brick compound feels like an ambush point. The air itself, a shimmering 120-degree blanket of dust and heat, is the enemy. It suffocates you slowly, drawing the life out of you, one drop of sweat at a time. We had just returned to the forward operating base from a 4-hour patrol that had shredded what was left of our nerves. The tension still clung to me, like the fine pale dust that covered every inch of my uniform. Less than an hour ago, a local kid, no older than 10, had darted out onto the road in front of our lead vehicle. We all froze. Every one of us held our breath, the air turning to stone in our lungs. Our gunner's hands tensed on the trigger. Was it a game? Or was he a lure, a tragic human bait for a vehicle-borne IED? The seconds stretched into an eternity until he just as suddenly darted back into an alleyway, leaving us with nothing but the frantic hammering of our own hearts. The adrenaline was still a bitter, metallic taste in the back of my throat. "Staff Sergeant Ward!" The shout from the comms officer cut through the low hum of the base. I turned, my professional mask sliding into place. I walked toward the command tent, my combat boots leaving faint prints in the dust, a temporary mark on a land that wanted us gone. The officer, a young lieutenant with earnest eyes, handed me a ruggedized tablet. "Email for you, Sergeant," came through the satellite link. I took it without a word, my expression unreadable. I'd trained for years to control my face, to project calm authority even when my insides were churning. It was just another piece of battlefield correspondence. Or so I thought. I stood there, under the relentless Afghan sun, and read the words from my father. They weren't written in ink. They felt like they were etched in ice. There was no "Dear Erica," no "Hope you're safe." It went straight for the kill. This little game of playing soldier is over. The phrase hit me with physical force. Game. 14 years of my life. 2 tours in Iraq, now this one in Afghanistan. Friends I'd lost. The bone-deep exhaustion, the constant fear, the immense pride in my uniform. All of it dismissed as a child's game. I read on, each word a new cut. He wrote of my brother, David, and his struggling construction business back home. He wrote of my duty. Not to my country, not to the soldiers under my command, but to my family. You will either come home immediately to take care of your brother like a woman should, or you will never see a single cent of this family's inheritance. Like a woman should. Those 4 words hurt more than any bullet could have. They were an attempt to erase everything I had become. They sought to strip away my rank, my honor, my entire identity, and shove me back into the small, suffocating box they had always reserved for me. I was not Staff Sergeant Ward, leader of soldiers. I was just a woman, and my purpose was to serve the men in my family. The inheritance wasn't a gift, it was a leash, and they were yanking on it, hard. I took a deep, steadying breath. The superheated air burned my lungs, a feeling that was blessedly, painfully real. It anchored me. I looked up from the screen, my eyes scanning the perimeter of the base, the distant, hazy mountains. Then I looked at my soldiers, stripping down their weapons, sharing water, their lives literally in my hands. My choice took less than a second. I handed the tablet back to the lieutenant. My voice was level, devoid of any emotion. Send a reply. Yes, Staff Sergeant, what's the message? Just one number, I said. 2. Just as the lieutenant walked away, a familiar thumping sound grew louder, and a Black Hawk helicopter descended toward the landing zone, kicking up a blinding whirlwind of dust. Mail call. A wave of cheers erupted from the soldiers nearby. It was a lifeline, a connection to the world we had left behind. As the bags were unloaded, Private First Class Miller, the kid I'd pulled back into the MRAP during a firefight just last week, jogged over to me. He was young, barely 20, with a face that hadn't yet hardened into a permanent mask of cynicism. He held out a slightly melted Hershey's bar. For you, Staff Sergeant, he said, a shy grin on his face. From my mom's care package, for, pulling me back in last week. I took the chocolate, the wrapper warm and gritty with dust. I simply nodded. Thanks, Miller. Make sure you hydrate. He nodded back, the respect in his eyes clear and unconditional. I stood there for a moment, the heavy weight of the chocolate bar in my palm. This was real. This simple gesture of gratitude from a young soldier whose life I'd protected. This was earned respect. This was kinship forged in fire and fear. This single dusty piece of chocolate from a kid from Ohio was worth more than every acre of land, every dollar in the bank. From a family that didn't even see me as a person. The contrast was so sharp, so absolute, it solidified my decision into something as hard as diamonds. That night, I didn't sleep. I took an extra watch shift, standing on the perimeter wall, my rifle resting in my hands. The desert had cooled, and the sky was an ocean of brilliant, unfamiliar stars. It was a beautiful, silent, deadly place. I wasn't thinking about the money. I was thinking about my mother. I thought about the promise I'd made to her, and to myself, at her grave so many years ago, that I would never, ever let anyone make me feel small again. That ultimatum from my father wasn't a rejection. I realized it with a clarity that was almost terrifying. It was a release. It was him, taking a knife and personally cutting the last frayed cord that tied me to them. Standing there, under those foreign stars, thousands of miles from the Tennessee soil that had raised me and then tried to bury me, I made a new vow. This isn't the end. This is the beginning. They will regret underestimating me. I didn't hesitate for a second when I sent that reply, because this wasn't the first shot they had fired. This was just the latest battle in a war that had been raging my entire life. Standing watch under that vast, silent sky, I realized my father's email wasn't a declaration of war. It was just another exhibit in my own private museum of scars, a collection of moments curated over a lifetime of being told I was less. My decision to reply with a single number wasn't made in that hot, dusty moment. It was forged years ago, piece by painful piece. The first exhibit is a dress. I was 16. I'd spent the entire summer working double shifts at the local Dairy Queen, the smell of waffle cones and burgers clinging to me long after I'd clocked out. I saved every single dollar for a prom dress I'd seen in a store window downtown. It was pale blue, almost the color of a Tennessee sky just after sunset, with tiny, delicate straps. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever owned. It was a promise of a single night where I could just be a normal teenage girl. The day before the prom, I found it. It was wadded up in a corner of the garage, smelling of grease and mud. My brother David had used it to wipe down his precious Ford F-150 after a day of mudding. Dark, greasy stains bloomed across the pale blue fabric like a disease. When I confronted him, my voice choked with sobs, he just laughed. I ran to my father, holding the ruined dress out like a piece of evidence. He glanced at it, then at me, his face impassive. "Boys will be boys, Erica," he said, his voice flat. "He's just being spirited. You're the older sister. You should know to be more forgiving. It's just a dress. Stop making a scene. It's just a dress." My mother found me crying in my room later. She didn't say a word, She just took the dress and spent hours in the laundry room, scrubbing at it with gentle, desperate hands. But the grease stains never truly came out. They just faded into ugly, permanent shadows, a constant reminder. I didn't go to prom. The next exhibit is a piece of paper. My high school diploma, naming me as valedictorian. It was an achievement I'd poured my entire soul into. A victory earned through sleepless nights and a relentless drive to prove I was more than just the quiet girl in the background. As I stood at the podium in the hot, stuffy gymnasium, looking out at a sea of faces, I found my family in the third row. My mother was smiling through her tears. My father and David sat beside her, stone-faced, their arms crossed. They didn't clap when my name was called. Not once. After the ceremony, our principal, Mr. Abernathy, came over to shake my hand, his face beaming with pride. "We are all so proud of you, Erica. A truly remarkable achievement." Before I could even say thank you, my father stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. He spoke loudly, his voice carrying to the other families standing nearby. "She's just good at useless book smarts," he announced with a dismissive wave of his hand. "My boy David, here. He's the one who's really going to make something of himself." The air was sucked from my lungs. Mr. Abernathy's smile faltered. In the single brightest moment of my young life, my own father had reached out and extinguished the light, publicly shaming me, making my triumph feel like a fraud. My pride turned to ash in my mouth. On the car ride home, no one said a word. The silence was louder than any argument. The final and most painful exhibit in my museum is a small, empty wooden box. It belonged to my mother. In her last days, as cancer ate away at her frail body, she held my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong, a final flicker of the vibrant woman she once was. "In my nightstand, Erica," she'd whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "There's a little rosewood box. It was my mother's. Now it's yours. Don't let anyone take it from you. It's your start." Inside was a simple gold locket, a pair of pearl earrings, and a few $100s in cash she had painstakingly saved. It wasn't a fortune, but it was everything. It was her belief in me, her quiet rebellion. After the funeral, after the casseroles and condolences had stopped coming, I found my bedroom door splintered at the lock. The rosewood box was gone from my drawer. I found David in the living room, counting the cash. When I demanded he give it back, he just smirked. That arrogant, entitled smirk that I had hated my entire life. "Mom must have been confused at the end," he said, stuffing the bills into his pocket. "What do you need a start for, anyway? You'll just get married, and some guy will take care of you." He had not only stolen my inheritance, he had stolen my mother's last words, her final wish, and twisted them into another insult. He erased my future and replaced it with the one they had always designed for me. All of these moments, all of these scars, led me to one place. The night before I left for basic training, I drove out to the cemetery. I sat on the cool grass in front of my mother's headstone, the marble glowing faintly in the moonlight. The loneliness was a physical weight pressing down on me. I didn't cry. The tears had dried up long ago. I just talked to her, my voice a low murmur in the quiet Tennessee night. "Mom, I'm leaving," I whispered to the stone. "I'm going to a place where my worth is measured by my actions, not my gender. A place where my last name doesn't mean I have to step aside for my brother. I'm going to make you proud." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree overhead, and for a moment it felt like a soft hand on my cheek, an affirmation. That was the only goodbye I got, and it was enough. It was enough to make me walk away without ever looking back. If you've ever had a moment of achievement, big or small, that was belittled by the very people who should have been cheering for you, please support this story with a like. And in the comments, just type a single word: "I understand." Let's show each other that we're not alone in this fight. So, no, I didn't hesitate. That email wasn't a new wound. It was just them pressing down on an old one, forgetting that over the years, my scars had turned into armor. The morning after my visit to my mother's grave, with the memory of that silent promise as my only shield, I walked into the Army recruitment office on Main Street. The sergeant behind the desk looked me up and down, probably seeing just another small-town girl looking for a way out. He wasn't wrong. I wasn't running from my town. I was running towards a chance to be defined by something other than my last name. That decision led me to a place that felt like the deepest circle of hell. Basic combat training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. From the moment I stepped off the bus, I was systematically broken down. They took my civilian clothes, my belongings, and my hair, which was shorn off in a matter of seconds, falling in a sad pile on the floor. Most importantly, they took my name. I was no longer Erica Ward. I was recruit. My individuality was stripped away, replaced by the uniformity of a green camouflage uniform that was too big for my frame. Every day began at 0500 hours with a drill sergeant's voice, a roar that could curdle milk, screaming inches from my face. I was smaller than most of the male recruits, a fact that did not go unnoticed. My senior drill sergeant, a man built like a brick wall with a jaw that looked like it could crack walnuts, took one look at me on the first day. He scanned me from my combat boots to my freshly buzzed hair, a sneer playing on his lips. "Well, look what we have here, a little country girl," he boomed, his voice echoing across the formation. "You think this is some kind of summer picnic, Ward? I guarantee you'll be crying for your mama before the week is out." The other recruits shuffled nervously. I just stared straight ahead, my jaw clenched so tight I felt a muscle twitch in my cheek. I didn't say a word. When he dismissed us, ordering everyone to drop for 20 push-ups, I dropped and gave him 40. I didn't do it to be defiant. I did it to make a statement to myself. I would not break. The weeks bled into a grueling montage of sweat, mud, and exhaustion. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the slow, grinding erosion of the spirit. The ultimate test came at the end of basic training, a multi-day field exercise the Army called the Forge. It was designed to be the final breaking point, a crucible that would either harden us into soldiers or shatter us completely. For nearly 3 days, we had almost no sleep, minimal food, and were pushed through a relentless series of combat scenarios, obstacle courses, and long, grueling marches under the hot Carolina sun. On the final day, during a 12-mile ruck march, I hit the wall. My rucksack, loaded with gear, felt like it was filled with cement. Each step was a battle. My legs were numb, my shoulders were raw, and a cold, creeping darkness was closing in at the edges of my vision. I was going to collapse. I knew it. This is it, I thought. This is as far as you go. Just as my knees began to buckle, I felt a slight pressure against my left side. I glanced over. It was Martinez, another female recruit from my platoon. We'd been fierce competitors from day one, always trying to outshoot, outrun, and outlast each other. We barely spoke. Now, she was marching shoulder to shoulder with me. Without a word, she subtly shifted her body, using her own shoulder to take a fraction of the weight of my rucksack. It was only for a few seconds, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. But it was enough. It was a silent message. I got you. Keep moving. In that moment, I understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than myself. I understood the sacred creed of the soldier. I will never leave a fallen comrade. But there was a different kind of pain that the Forge couldn't touch, a deeper ache that hit me every Sunday afternoon. That was when we were allowed a few precious hours of personal time, and a long line would form at the payphones. I'd watch as the other recruits, both men and women, waited patiently for their turn to call home. I'd sit on my bunk in the empty barracks, methodically stripping and cleaning my M16 rifle, the metallic scrape and click of the components echoing in the silence. I'd listen to the muffled sounds from the hallway, the bursts of laughter, the choked-up sobs, the quiet words of love and encouragement being exchanged over the phone lines. They had a lifeline, a connection to a world that was rooting for them, waiting for them. I had no one to call. My father and brother wouldn't have cared, and my mother was gone. That loneliness was a heavier burden than any rucksack. It was a cold, hollow space in my chest that the physical exhaustion couldn't fill. And in that hollow space, a hard, unshakable resolve began to form. If I didn't have a family to fight for back home, then this, the Army, the soldiers to my left and right, this would be my family. I had nowhere else to belong. The graduation ceremony was a blur of crisp uniforms and proud families. As we stood in formation, our drill sergeants walked down the line, placing a black beret on each of our heads. When my drill sergeant, the same one who had mocked me on day one, reached me, he paused. He placed the beret on my head, his movements precise. And for the first time, he didn't call me recruit or country girl. He looked me straight in the eye and said, his voice low and firm, "Soldier." A single tear escaped and traced a path through the dirt on my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or relief. It was a tear of pure, undiluted pride. It was the recognition I had craved my entire life, a validation earned not by birthright or gender, but by grit and perseverance. After the ceremony was dismissed, he found me standing alone. He walked up, stopping directly in front of me, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "You earned it, Ward," he said, his voice stripped of its usual roar. "You earned it." Those 4 words, coming from the man who had pushed me to my absolute limit, were the most profound praise I had ever received. They were worth more than any inheritance, more than any hollow words of approval from a father who saw me as a game and a brother who saw me as a burden. For years after that day, the Army was my family. It was simple, it was clear. You earned your place. Then, during my first deployment to Iraq, something arrived that I never expected. A letter. From a complete stranger. For years, the Army was my shelter and my family. It was a harsh and demanding parent, but it was fair. You earned your keep, you watched your brother's back, and you were judged on your actions alone. It was a simple, brutal meritocracy, and I thrived in it. The idea of unconditional kindness, of compassion without cause, was a foreign concept. Then, during my first deployment to Iraq, a simple paper envelope arrived that changed everything. Mail call was a familiar ritual. Names were shouted, and soldiers would eagerly grab letters and packages from home, their faces lighting up with news from a world away. My name was never called. I never expected it to be. So, when the mail clerk yelled, "Sergeant Ward," I almost didn't react. He had to call it twice. The letter was addressed to me, but the return address was a place I'd never heard of. Burlington, Vermont. The handwriting was neat, elegant cursive. I opened it with a strange sense of caution. Inside, the letter was from a woman named Sarah Gable. She explained that she was a widowed school teacher who had signed up for a program called Adopt a Soldier. My name, she wrote, had been given to her at random from a list. Her letter was simple. It wasn't filled with pity or patriotic platitudes. She asked about my life there, what the weather was like, as if I could describe that oppressive heat in a letter. And if there was anything I needed. She told me about the first signs of autumn in Vermont, the way the maple trees were just beginning to turn fiery red and gold. She wrote as if we were old friends catching up. I must have read that letter a dozen times, sitting on my cot in the suffocating heat of the tent. It felt so strange, so surreal, to be the subject of a complete stranger's quiet concern. I wrote back, my own letter stiff and formal at first, but I sent it. A few weeks later, a package arrived. It wasn't large, just a simple cardboard box, but it felt as heavy as gold. I opened it back at my bunk. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were 3 pairs of thick, hand-knitted wool socks. Beneath them was a tin filled with homemade chocolate chip cookies, still smelling faintly of butter and vanilla. There was also a worn paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and a small handwritten note that simply said, "Stay warm and stay safe, Erica. Sarah." I sat there, in the middle of a war zone, and ate a cookie. It was soft and chewy, nothing like the dry, processed food we ate every day. For the first time in more years than I could count, I felt something that felt dangerously close to being cared for. A few of the guys in my squad teased me about having a pen pal mom, but I didn't care. I carefully folded the letter and put it inside the book, and I kept the box. It was the first exhibit in a new museum, one I was building for myself. We kept writing for years, through that deployment and the next. I sent her photos of myself in uniform, standing awkwardly in front of a Humvee. She sent me news from Vermont, photos of her garden in the spring, and more care packages. Her letters became a quiet anchor in the chaos of my life. Years later, I was on leave, traveling from my base in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, to visit a friend in Boston. My connecting flight was at Chicago O'Hare. But as I sat at the gate, an announcement crackled over the intercom. A massive blizzard had hit the East Coast. All flights were grounded indefinitely. I was stranded. I settled in for a long, miserable night on an uncomfortable airport chair, just another anonymous soldier in transit. "Excuse me, are you Sergeant Ward?" I looked up. A woman with kind blue eyes and silver hair pulled back in a loose bun was standing in front of me. She was holding a photo, one of the ones I had sent her. My heart stopped. "Sarah?" I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. It was her. She was at the airport to pick up her granddaughter, whose flight had also been canceled. She recognized me from across the terminal. Her smile was even warmer in person. Without a moment's hesitation, she reached down and took my duffel bag. "Well, you can't stay here," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You're coming home with me." I spent the next 3 days snowed in at Sarah Gable's house. It was a cozy little home with warm, creaking wood floors, and it constantly smelled of baking bread and the soft scent of pine from the crackling fireplace. She didn't press me with questions about the war or why a soldier on leave was traveling alone. She just treated me like family. We cooked together in her bright yellow kitchen. We watched old black and white movies on her small television, curled up under Afghan blankets as the snow swirled outside. She gave me a real bed in a quiet guest room filled with books and handmade quilts. On the last night, she brought me an extra blanket, a heavy quilted one that felt like a hug. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her expression soft. "You know, I am so proud of you, Erica," she said quietly. "I am so proud of you." 3 simple words. The same 3 words I'd spent a lifetime starving to hear from my own father. Hearing them from Sarah, spoken with such simple, genuine sincerity, it broke something open inside of me. She saw me, the real me. Not a disappointment, not a burden, not a stand-in for a son. Just me. And she was proud. Later that night, tucked into the warm, safe bed in the guest room, I cried. I cried for the first time since my mother had died. They weren't tears of sadness or self-pity. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude. For the first time, I felt what it was like to be home. The peace I found in Sarah's house felt like it could last forever. But a few months later, back in the dust of Afghanistan, the ghost of my old life found me. It arrived not as a letter, but as a crackle over a satellite phone, with my brother's voice on the other end. The peace I found in Sarah's home, that feeling of unconditional acceptance, became a quiet fortress in my mind. It was a place I could retreat to during the long, grueling months that followed. But fortresses are meant to be tested. A few months after I'd returned to Afghanistan, just as my platoon was gearing up for a critical night operation, the ghost of my old life found me. It arrived not as an email, but as a crackle over a satellite phone with my brother's voice on the other end. The call was patched through to the command tent. I took the receiver, my mind already running through pre-combat checklists. Then I heard his voice, and a cold stillness settled over me. "Erica? Hey, it's me. David." His voice was syrupy sweet and a natural warmth that set off every alarm bell in my head. Wow, it's been too long. I remained silent. My military training had perfected the art of the poker face, of listening more than speaking. He didn't mention the ultimatum. He didn't mention my one-word reply. He just launched into a performance, asking how I was, if I was safe. He said he and Dad were so worried about me. The words felt hollow, manufactured. He painted a grim picture of life back home. The construction business was struggling, the economy was tough, and Dad wasn't doing so well. His health was failing. It was a textbook guilt trip, and I recognized the strategy immediately. This was reconnaissance. He was probing my defenses. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking, my voice flat. "What do you want, David?" He finally dropped the pretense. "Look, Dad's scheduled for a minor surgery soon. Nothing serious, but it's got him thinking. He wants to revise the will, make sure everything is fair. He paused, letting the word fair hang in the air like bait. I didn't bite. He wants you to come home, David continued, his voice lowering conspiratorially. All you have to do is sign a few papers, just a formality, really. You sign away your claim on the construction company so I can use it as collateral for a bank loan. And in return, Dad will give you a piece of Mom's land. A wave of nausea washed over me. Mom's land, the one piece of this family I still felt a connection to. The acres of rolling Tennessee hills she had loved, the place she'd inherited from her own mother. He was dangling our mother's memory in front of me, trying to trade it for my signature. The sheer audacity of it, the cold, calculating cruelty, almost took my breath away. Before I could respond, he said, "Hold on, Dad wants to talk to you." There was a rustle on the other end, and then my father's voice came on the line. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, but now it was different. It was weak, frail, and laced with a counterfeit remorse that was more sickening than David's fake friendliness. "Erica, honey," he began, the unfamiliar term of endearment grating on my ears. "Daughter, I'm sorry I was so hard on you. A father just wants what's best for his children. You know that. Family is everything, sweetheart. It's all that matters in the end. Please, just come home. We need you." His words were like a sweet poison. For a split second, a foolish, naive part of me, the 16-year-old girl who just wanted her father to be proud of her, wanted to believe him. The longing for a real family, for a home where I was needed and loved, surged up like a phantom limb, an ache for something that had never been there. I pictured it. A reconciliation, a quiet peace, a family healed. But then 14 years of discipline snapped back into place. 14 years of learning to read situations, to identify threats, to recognize a trap when I saw one. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a Trojan horse. They didn't need me. They needed something from me. I kept my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside. "I need to think about it," I said. "I'll call you back." I hung up before they could argue. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so cold it felt like ice water in my veins. I didn't sit and agonize. I did what a soldier does when faced with questionable intel. I conducted reconnaissance. I used my 15-minute break to make one more satellite call. To the only person in my family I still trusted, my Uncle Jim, my mother's younger brother. He was a quiet man, a mechanic who lived 2 towns over. He'd always had a soft spot for me, and he'd never been a fan of my father's arrogance or David's entitlement. I got straight to the point. I told him about the call, the surgery, the offer. The silence on his end was heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a weary sadness. "Oh, Erica," he sighed, "there's no surgery. Your father is as healthy as a horse. It's David. The business is about to go under. He spent money like water on a new truck, bad investments. You know how he is. He's deep in debt, and the bank is threatening to foreclose." He paused, and I could hear him take a deep breath. "They need a loan, a big one. And the bank won't give it to them unless they put up your mother's land as collateral. The land is in both your names as co-heirs. They need your signature to mortgage it. They're not trying to give you a piece of it, honey. They need you to give up all of it so David can save himself." The truth landed with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a lie. It was a calculated, cruel deception designed to prey on my deepest vulnerabilities. They had tried to use my father's fake illness and my mother's memory as weapons against me. Any flicker of hope I might have harbored that they had changed, that they felt any remorse, was instantly extinguished. It was snuffed out, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard certainty of their betrayal. The silence on my end of the line after I'd spoken to them hadn't been indecision. It was the calm before the storm. And they had no idea what kind of storm they had just unleashed. The cold rage that settled in my heart after that call with Uncle Jim didn't dissipate. It crystallized. It became a hard, sharp weapon that I carried silently inside me. I had a war to fight, a real one, and the petty dramas of my family were a distraction I couldn't afford. But the universe has a cruel sense of irony. Just a few days later, The lines between my two wars blurred in the most horrific way imaginable. We were on patrol, rolling through a sun-bleached valley that the locals called the Valley of Whispers. The name was fitting. The silence was heavy, watchful. Our vehicle, the second in the convoy, was rounding a narrow bend when the world erupted in a flash of white-hot light and a deafening roar. An IED. The vehicle in front of us was tossed into the air like a child's toy, engulfed in a ball of fire and black smoke. Time warped. Everything moved in a horrifying slow motion. I remember the shockwave hitting us, the rain of sand and metal against our vehicle's armor. I remember the screaming over the comms. And I remember getting out and running towards the wreckage, my training taking over my body while my soul screamed. We found PFC Miller, the kid who had given me the Hershey bar, the kid with the shy grin from Ohio. He was alive, barely. I was there with the medic, trying to stop the bleeding, my hands covered in his blood. I held his hand, talking to him, telling him help was on the way, telling him he was a hero. I stayed with him until his eyes went vacant, until the life just slipped away. The grief that followed was a physical presence. It was a heavy shroud that suffocated the air at the base. Losing a soldier under your command is a pain I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It's a failure that brands itself onto your soul. Every bit of patience I might have had for my family's selfish games, every ounce of tolerance, was incinerated in that blast. It was all gone, burned away by the sheer, brutal finality of Miller's death. I was in the middle of the grim administrative chaos that follows a KIA. Casualty reports, inventories of personal effects, the first draft of the letter to his parents, when the satellite phone rang again. It was for me. A part of me knew who it was, but the sheer disbelief that they would call again so soon was staggering. I took the receiver. "Hey, it's me." David's voice was tinny and impatient, devoid of any of the fake warmth from before. "So, have you made a decision yet? We don't have all day here." We don't have all day. His words, his tone, his utter self-absorbed blindness to a world outside his own petty needs struck me at that precise moment of raw grief. It was like throwing a lit match into a tanker full of gasoline. The explosion was silent, but it was absolute. The cold, disciplined armor I'd worn for a lifetime cracked, and the pure, white-hot rage underneath was unleashed. I took one, deep, steadying breath. When I spoke, my voice was no longer my own. It was a low, lethal thing, as cold and sharp as a shard of polar ice. "My decision?" I said, the words perfectly spaced. "All right, listen carefully, David, because I am only going to say this once. You people took my childhood," I began, my voice a low, controlled fury. "You stole my mother's legacy. And now you have the audacity to ask me to sacrifice my honor, the only thing I have truly built for myself, to bail you out of your own failures. The answer is no. Never." "What the hell are you talking about?" He started yelling into the phone, his voice rising in panic and indignation. "Dad is sick. It's about family." I spoke right over him, my voice cutting through his like a razor. "And listen to me now. That land belonged to our mother. I will not let you touch it with your filthy, greedy hands. This war you started with that email, it isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning." My voice dropped to a near whisper, filled with a venom he had never heard before. "Right now, I am busy arranging to send a real hero home in a box. A young man who died for something you will never, ever understand. Do not ever call me again." I slammed the receiver down, cutting off his sputtering protests. The connection went dead. The tent was still filled with the organized chaos of a base on high alert. But inside me, for the first time in my entire life, there was a profound, unnerving calm. The tumor of my family, the one that had been poisoning my life for 32 years, had been cut out. I was free. But fate, it seems, has a twisted sense of humor. 2 weeks later, during a firefight in a different sector, my luck ran out. We were taking cover when a rocket-propelled grenade hit a wall near me. I was lucky. It wasn't a direct hit, but a piece of shrapnel, A hot, jagged piece of steel tore through my leg. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough. It was my ticket home. If you have ever reached a breaking point where you finally stood up and drew a line in the sand, hit the like button as a salute to that moment. In the comments below, tell me what gave you the strength to finally say, no more. Was it one big event, or 1,000 small cuts? The irony was almost too much to bear. The war I had just declared over a satellite phone, the one I intended to fight from thousands of miles away, would now have to be fought on the enemy's home turf. I was going home. Not as a daughter, but as a soldier on a new mission. Landing back on American soil wasn't a victory parade. It was a deployment to a new war zone, home. The flight to Tennessee was quiet. The throb in my leg, a constant dull ache from the shrapnel, was a physical reminder of the war I had just left. But my mind was already focused on the next one. The war I had declared over a satellite phone was about to begin in person. I didn't call anyone. I didn't go to the family home. My first tactical decision was to remain unseen. I took a cab from the airport to a small anonymous motel off the highway, a place with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. Room 112 became my forward operating base. The quiet, sleepy hum of my hometown was a jarring contrast to the constant noise of a military base, but in its own way, it felt just as hostile. The first week was about discipline. Every morning, I forced myself through the painful, tedious physical therapy exercises the Army doctors had prescribed. I pushed my body with the same relentless discipline I'd learned at Fort Jackson, rebuilding my strength one grueling repetition at a time. The rest of the day was spent planning my campaign. I wasn't going to storm the gates with anger and accusations. That was my brother's style. Mine would be a silent campaign, waged with intelligence, strategy, and precision. My first move was to secure an ally. Through a veteran support network online, I found the Valor Law Group, a firm in Nashville staffed entirely by former military lawyers. I made an appointment. I sat across from a man named Marcus Thorne, a former Marine captain with sharp eyes and a calm, commanding presence. I didn't cry or tell him a long, emotional story. I gave him a situation report, laying out the facts with the same dispassionate clarity I'd use in a mission briefing. The history of the family business, the details of my mother's will, the ultimatum, and the manipulative phone call. He listened intently, not interrupting once. When I was finished, he steepled his fingers, a small grim smile on his face. "Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Most people in your situation want to charge straight into battle. We're not going to do that." He leaned forward. "We're not going to wage a war. We're going to conduct a siege. We will cut off his supply lines, gather intelligence, and let him collapse under the weight of his own arrogance. He won't even see the attack coming." For the first time since I'd been home, I felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. I had my first ally. My first mission, under Marcus's guidance, was intelligence gathering. The next day, I drove my rental car to the county courthouse downtown. It was a sleepy brick building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. At the records office, a kind, older woman with a beehive hairdo peered at me over her glasses. "Well, I'll be," she said, her southern drawl warm and familiar. "You're one of the ward girls, aren't you? The one who went into the service." "Yes, ma'am," I said. "Erica." "We're all very proud of you, dear," she said, and her genuine warmth was a stark contrast to the reason I was there. I told her I needed to see the public property and business filings connected to my family's name. She nodded knowingly and with a quiet efficiency began pulling files. I spent hours at a dusty table, sifting through deeds, loan agreements, and incorporation papers. And there, in the dry, bureaucratic language of legal documents, was the cold, hard proof of my brother's betrayal. It was worse than I imagined. I found a copy of a power of attorney, signed by my father just weeks after my mother's death, giving David complete control over all family assets. My father's signature looked shaky, uncertain. Using that document, David had taken out a massive mortgage on our mother's land. He had sold off smaller family properties, and he had funneled the money not just into his failing business, but into a series of shell companies with opaque names. The anger I felt was no longer a hot, emotional thing. It was a cold, solid certainty. This wasn't just a feeling of betrayal anymore. It was a provable, documented crime. With copies of the documents secured in a briefcase on the passenger seat, I felt a strange compulsion. I drove through the old part of town, towards the house I grew up in. I told myself I just wanted to see it one last time, to close that chapter for good. It looked smaller than I remembered, the paint peeling slightly on the porch. David's new oversized pickup truck was parked in the driveway. And then I saw him. On the sidewalk across the street, huddled on a bus stop bench, was a man. He was thin, gaunt, his clothes ragged and dirty. His hair was matted, and he stared into space with a vacant, hollow-eyed expression that chilled me to the bone. It took me a long, staggering moment to place the familiar set of his jaw, the shape of his hands. It was my father, the patriarch, the tyrant who had written me off, the man whose fake illness was supposed to be the key to the whole scheme. He was homeless. He was sitting across the street, staring at the house he had built, a ghost haunting his own life. My brother hadn't just tricked our father. He hadn't just used him. He had taken everything from him, and then, when he was no longer useful, he had thrown him out onto the street like a piece of trash. My carefully planned siege, my cold, methodical campaign against a single enemy, had just become infinitely more complicated. The battlefield had changed, and I was standing right in the middle of it. Finding my father on that bench was a variable I hadn't accounted for. My mission had been simple: expose David, protect my mother's legacy. But now, I had a refugee. I took him from that curb, got him cleaned up, and settled him into a small rented cabin in the woods outside of town. He was a ghost, a broken man haunted by the ruins of his own kingdom. My plan, however, did not change. It merely adapted. The siege was over. It was time for the final assault. The battlefield was the monthly town hall meeting, held in the old municipal auditorium. It was the heart of our small town's civic life, a place where reputations were made and broken under the harsh fluorescent lights. My brother David was the keynote speaker. He was petitioning the council to approve his grand new housing development, the project he was trying to finance with our mother's land. I sat in the back row with my lawyer, Marcus. A few rows ahead of us, I saw my father. He sat alone, hunched over, looking small and lost in a borrowed suit. He looked ashamed. He should be. David took the stage like he was born for it. He was charming, confident, radiating the easy privilege of a man who had never been told no. He spoke eloquently about his vision for a better community, a place for families to grow. He laced his speech with all the right words: family values, our shared heritage, honoring the legacy of our forefathers. The town council, the mayor, the audience. They were all captivated. They were looking at David Ward, the successful son, the future of our town. I watched the performance, my heart beating a slow, steady, tactical rhythm. I was just waiting for my moment. He finished his speech to a round of enthusiastic applause. He beamed, soaking in the admiration, his smile wide and triumphant. And in that precise moment of his victory, the heavy oak doors at the back of the auditorium swung open. I walked in. I wasn't wearing my uniform, just a simple button-down shirt and jeans. I still walked with a slight limp. The shrapnel wound a dull, persistent ache. But I walked with my back straight, my head held high, the way the army had taught me. I moved down the center aisle, my boots making a quiet, steady sound on the worn linoleum floor. A ripple went through the room. Conversations died. The applause faltered and then stopped completely. A thick, shocked silence descended. Every eye in the room turned to me, the daughter who had disappeared, the soldier. I saw David's face. His triumphant smile froze, then cracked, melting away into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His face went pale. I didn't look at him. I didn't acknowledge him. I walked past the rows of familiar, stunned faces, old neighbors, former teachers, people who had watched me grow up, and went directly to the public comment microphone set up in the aisle. I adjusted it slightly, the metallic scrape echoing in the dead quiet. When I spoke, my voice was calm, clear, and steady. It carried through the auditorium without a single tremor. "Good evening," I began, addressing the council but looking at the crowd. "My name is Staff Sergeant Erica Ward." I let my rank hang in the air for a second. "I don't have a comment on the zoning proposal. I just have a question for Mr. David Ward, who was just speaking so passionately about family legacy." I turned my head slowly and looked directly at him, pinning him in place with my gaze. He looked like a cornered animal. "Mr. Ward," I asked, my voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, "does the family legacy you're referring to include manipulating your elderly father into signing over power of attorney, selling off his assets, and then kicking him out onto the street to live like a homeless person?" A collective gasp swept through the auditorium. A low murmur of disbelief and shock started to build. David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I didn't wait for an answer. I gave a subtle nod towards the back doors. On cue, Marcus walked in. And on his arm, frail and trembling, was our father. Marcus gently guided him to the front of the room, to stand in the open space before the council, a living, breathing exhibit of David's cruelty. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder, turning into whispers of, "Oh my God," and "Is that really?" I turned my attention back to my brother. My voice was as cold and sharp as steel. "And this community project you're proposing, is it by any chance being funded with the money you acquired by illegally mortgaging the land my mother left to both of her children using forged documents?" I stepped forward and placed a thick manila folder on the council's table with a soft, definitive thud. "All the evidence is right here," I said, my voice resonating in the charged silence. "The fraudulent power of attorney, the loan agreements, the bank records for the shell companies, it's all here." I stepped back from the microphone. My part was done. I looked at David. All the color had drained from his face. He was chalk white, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, but no words came out. His hands were shaking. In the space of 2 questions, his entire world, the empire of lies he had built on a foundation of arrogance and theft, had crumbled to dust around him. It didn't end with a bang. It ended with the quiet, devastating whisper of the truth. Victory wasn't a jubilant celebration. It wasn't a parade. It was the heavy, suffocating silence in the rental car on the way back to the small cabin I'd found for my father. The explosion of truth at the town hall had happened, but now, in its wake, there was only the fallout. The news of David's spectacular downfall spread through town like wildfire, but there was no triumphant feeling for me. Instead, there was just a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The war I'd been fighting my entire life was finally over, and I was left standing in the quiet rubble with no idea what to do next. My father and I coexisted in that small cabin for days, moving around each other in a quiet, awkward dance. The silence between us was a chasm filled with 30 years of unspoken resentment and neglect. I made sure he had food, that he was comfortable, but I kept my distance. I was a caretaker, not a daughter, not in the way he had once demanded. One evening, we were sitting on the porch in 2 old rocking chairs, listening to the sound of crickets in the Tennessee twilight. The air was thick with the smell of honeysuckle. For the first time, he spoke without being spoken to. His voice was a hoarse, broken thing. "I saw you," he said, his gaze fixed on the darkening woods. "At the town hall. The way you stood there. The way you took control." He paused, and I heard a hitch in his breath. "Your mother. She would have been so proud." The mention of her name from his lips was a shock. He turned to look at me then, and his eyes, once so full of judgment and authority, were now just the watery, red-rimmed eyes of a defeated old man. Tears began to trace paths through the weathered lines on his face. "I was wrong, Erica," he wept, the words tumbling out in ragged sobs. "All these years, I was so wrong. I bet on the wrong horse. My pride, my damned pride, it destroyed everything." I didn't move to comfort him. I didn't offer a tissue or a soothing word. I just sat there, my chair rocking gently, and let him cry. I listened. His confession didn't magically heal the scars he'd inflicted, but it was necessary. It was the acknowledgement of a truth I'd waited a lifetime to hear. A few days later, there was a furious pounding on the cabin door. It was David. He was out on bail, his face a twisted mask of rage and disbelief. He didn't come to apologize. He came to attack. "You!" he spat, his finger jabbing in my direction. "You venomous snake! You took everything from me. You ruined my life." I looked at him, standing on my porch, a man twice my size reduced to a sputtering, blame-filled child. The anger I once felt for him was gone, replaced by a strange and hollow pity. He hadn't learned a thing. "I didn't take anything from you, David," I said, my voice calm and even. "I just held up a mirror. You did this to yourself." He opened his mouth to hurl another insult, but I simply turned, walked back inside, and shut the door in his face. The soft click of the lock was the last conversation we would ever have. The legal proceedings were messy, but with the evidence I had, the outcome was never in doubt. David faced fraud charges, and the company was forced into bankruptcy. Through the court, the title to my mother's land was cleared and returned to me, along with a portion of the other remaining assets. My father could never live alone again. He was a broken man, both in spirit and in health, but I would not be his caretaker. That was the role he had tried to force on me, and I would not accept it. I used a portion of the recovered money to secure him a place at a comfortable assisted living facility an hour away. It was a nice place, with gardens and good medical care. He would be safe. He would be looked after. I drove him there myself. I helped him get settled in his new room. I visited him once a week for the first few months, then twice a month after that. Our visits were quiet, polite. We talked about the weather. I brought him books. I was fulfilling my duty as a daughter, but on my own terms. I had drawn a new boundary, clear and unbreakable. During one of those visits, as I was about to leave, he took my hand. "Can you ever forgive me, Erica?" he asked, his voice pleading. I looked down at our hands, his old and trembling, mine scarred and strong. "I forgive you," I said, and I meant it. I pulled my hand gently from his. "I forgive you not because you deserve it, Dad, but because I deserve peace." With my father settled and David a ghost of the past, only one question remained. What to do with the land? My mother's land. It had been the catalyst for so much pain, the prize in a war of greed and betrayal, but I refused to let that be its final legacy. It was time to build something new from the ashes. I knew what my mother, the quiet woman who had dreamed of a start for her daughter, would have wanted. And I knew what I had to do. The peace I had earned was not a quiet, passive thing. It was an active peace, a peace with purpose. And its first mission was to decide the fate of my mother's land. For weeks, I walked the rolling Tennessee hills where she had walked, feeling the soft grass under my boots. This land had been a battleground, a prize to be fought over. It was soaked in betrayal. I could have sold it, erased the past, and walked away with the money. But that would have been my father's way, not mine. I decided to redefine its legacy. I spent my remaining weeks of convalescent leave on the phone, working with Marcus and a dozen different veteran nonprofit organizations. Together, we drew up plans. My mother's land would not be sold for another soulless housing development. It would become a sanctuary. We would build Ward's Landing, a transitional housing and rehabilitation center for female veterans struggling with homelessness, PTSD, and the difficult return to civilian life. The land that my mother had hoped would be my start would now become a new start for hundreds of my sisters in arms. The inheritance that was used as a weapon of betrayal would be transformed into an instrument of healing. That, I knew, was the most fitting tribute to my mother's quiet strength. A few months later, just before I was scheduled to redeploy, an official-looking envelope arrived from the Department of the Army. It was a letter from my commanding officer. He informed me that he had put me in for a medal, not for any single act of valor in combat, but for my entire tour. He had recommended me for the Legion of Merit. The citation mentioned my combat leadership, but it also cited my extraordinary moral character and unwavering resilience in the face of significant personal adversity while deployed. They had seen more than just the soldier. They had seen the whole fight. The award ceremony was a small formal affair at my home base. I stood at attention in my dress uniform, the sharp creases feeling both familiar and foreign after months in civilian clothes. As my name was called, I saw a familiar face in the small crowd of attendees. Sarah, my Vermont mom, had flown all the way down for the ceremony. My CO read the citation, and then Sarah was invited to pin the medal on my uniform. As she carefully affixed the striking 5-pointed star to my chest, she leaned in close. Her voice was a soft whisper meant only for me. "Your mother," she said, her eyes shining with tears, "would be so, so proud." And this time, hearing those words, I didn't feel the old ache of what I had lost. I only felt the profound, overwhelming gratitude for what I had found. My story, somehow, had started to circulate within the veteran community. A week after the ceremony, I was asked to speak at a conference for women in the armed forces. I was terrified. I was trained to lead soldiers into a fight, not to stand in front of a crowd and bare my soul. As I stood backstage, I thought of a Bible verse my mother used to read. One she'd underlined in her worn old Bible, Isaiah 41:10. "So do not fear, for I am with you." I took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. I stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces. Young lieutenants, seasoned master sergeants, new recruits. All women who knew the unique challenges of our chosen path. And I told them my story, not with bitterness, but with the hard-won wisdom of a survivor. "The greatest courage," I said, my voice steady and clear, "is sometimes not facing enemy fire, but facing the silence in your own home. They might try to take your inheritance, your opportunities, even your own name. But you can never ever let them take your voice. Because your voice, once you find the courage to use it, is the only legacy that truly matters. It is priceless." The journey back to Afghanistan felt different this time. It wasn't an escape anymore, it was a return. As I stepped off the C-130 transport plane and onto the familiar, dusty tarmac of the Kandahar airfield, I saw them. My squad, my guys. They were all standing there, waiting. A cheer went up, a ragged, joyous sound in the dry desert air. They clapped me on the back, their grins wide and genuine. My platoon sergeant, a grizzled old warrior named Gunny, stepped forward. He stuck out his hand. "Welcome home, Staff Sergeant," he said. And for the first time, a real, unguarded smile spread across my face. I shook his hand, feeling the solid, calloused grip of a trusted brother. I looked at the faces of my soldiers, my family. I was home. Here, in this broken, beautiful, dangerous land, surrounded by the men and women I would die for, and who would die for me. I had finally found my family. I had found my peace. And most importantly, I had found myself. And that's my story. My war back home is over, but my service, in every sense of the word, continues. My journey is proof that our past does not have to be our future, and that the deepest scars can be repurposed into our greatest strengths. I found my true family in the heat of battle and the kindness of strangers. In the comments, I'd be honored if you shared one word that describes the family you chose for yourself. For more stories that prove the strongest spirits are the ones tested by fire, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for hearing my voice.